The Crossover Point, by Robert X. Bishop. The Tupolev Tu-154 sat dying on the tarmac at Raduzhny Airport, its fuselage trembling in the Siberian night like a wounded animal. Robert pressed his face against the scratched porthole window and watched his breath crystallize instantly on the glass. Outside, the runway stretched into darkness, not asphalt, not concrete, but a vast sheet of ice that gleamed dully under the sodium lights. -40 degrees. The thought came to him unrequested, a scientist's reflex even under these extreme conditions. The crossover point. The temperature where Fahrenheit and Celsius converge, where two different ways of measuring the same brutal reality become identical. Only someone like Robert, trained in science, would think of such a thing under these circumstances. But real scientists don't think like other people. No one truly understands them, Robert supposed, because they truly don't understand themselves. The cabin was already packed beyond the aircraft's operational weight limit. Carry-on luggage spilled into the aisles, canvas duffel bags, cardboard boxes, bound with twine, plastic shopping sacks, bulging with only God knew what, the desperate detritus of people fleeing back to the relative civilization of Moscow or St. Petersburg by way of Perm. Raduzhny Airport was the only exit point, and everyone knew it. Robert settled into his tattered seat, the fabric worn smooth by 1,000 previous passengers, and felt Zhenya's solid presence beside him. His Russian partner said nothing, but Robert could sense the tension in the man's shoulders, the way his fingers drummed once, then twice against his thigh, before going still. The Tu-154 had been specifically designed to operate from remote airfields lacking ground support equipment, using its internal systems to maintain cabin temperature and engine heat on frigid Siberian nights. Tonight, the old Soviet aircraft was struggling to stay alive. Robert closed his eyes and let his mind drift backward, away from the present danger, to the 5 years that had brought him to this moment. The cover story had been simple, elegant in its mundanity. Robert was there to provide telecommunications support for the White Nights Russian-American joint venture. His legend had been meticulously constructed over half a decade, layer upon careful layer, until even he sometimes forgot where the fiction ended and the man began. And on that account, at least, the trip had been very successful. He had overseen the installation of a VSAT terminal that would shift communications from the incredibly expensive and increasingly sad Inmarsat terminals that had been the only option before. The equipment had arrived in crates marked with Cyrillic and English, and Robert had spent 3 days in a prefabricated building that smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, his fingers numb despite the gloves, calibrating the dish to find the satellite's whisper in the vast electromagnetic noise. Then there was the VHF repeater. For that, he had paid a couple of Siberian Eskimos, dollars of course, and vodka, and chocolate, to climb the rickety tower in sub-zero weather to install the antenna and hard line. Robert had watched them ascend, their movements efficient and unhurried despite the wind that threatened to tear them from the frozen metal. While the Russians and the American expats looked down on these aboriginals with barely concealed contempt, Robert held them in the highest respect. The locals called them Chukchi, but the name they called themselves was Yupigit, which roughly translated to mean true people. Robert had heard a similar word in Cherokee with a similar meaning, and he'd thought more than once that there might be a connection between the Yupigit and the Cherokee. Something to do with the land bridge across the Aleutian Straits, migrations lost to time, the deep memory of peoples who had walked across a frozen world when the ice still connected continents. He'd paid them well and thanked them in their own language, just a few words, carefully learned, and had seen the surprise and pleasure in their weathered faces. Last but not least, there was the low-power TV station. Robert smiled at the memory even now, sitting in the doomed aircraft. He had set up the transmitter and connected it to a satellite feed carrying American television programming. The mayor of Raduzhny had insisted on being present for the first broadcast, and Robert had found himself trying to explain The Simpsons to a bewildered Soviet bureaucrat as they watched in full transcoded NTSC to CCAM color on an old Orbita television set. But why is the father so stupid? The mayor had asked, genuinely perplexed. It's satire, Robert had explained. A commentary on American family life. And the baby with the mayor had gestured vaguely at his own head, trying to indicate Maggie's pacifier. Yes, the baby doesn't talk. This is popular in America. Very popular. The mayor had shaken his head slowly, as if this confirmed everything he'd ever suspected about the West, and poured them both another shot of vodka. Those had been good days in their way. The work had been real, the accomplishments tangible. Robert had given the White Nights expats and the locals something they never expected, a connection to the wider world, voices in the darkness, light and sound transmitted across the void. It almost made him forget why he was really there. Almost. The intelligence had been fragmentary, whispered through channels that barely existed anymore in the chaos following the Soviet collapse. A portable rocket launcher and tactical nuke had gone missing from a Red Army unit stationed near Raduzhny. Robert had made it his business to befriend that unit, or what remained of it. They were disbanded now, officially, but they remained together as much for camaraderie as for safety. In the new Russia, a group of armed men with military training had value, even if that value was only in the deterrence of other armed men. They had accepted him slowly, warily, but Robert knew how to drink without getting drunk, how to listen more than he spoke, how to show respect without servility. He'd fixed their radio when it broke. He'd shared his American cigarettes. He'd asked about their families and remembered their children's names. And eventually, they had taken him into the tundra. The MAZ-7907 was a monster, a 24x24 truck designed to carry and launch RT-23 nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles. Robert had seen photographs in classified briefings, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of the thing. A vehicle so massive it seemed to belong to a different scale of existence, as if giants had built it for purposes beyond human comprehension. Now it was without its missile, repurposed to carry logs and drilling equipment across the frozen waste. "Where is the rocket?" Robert had asked, keeping his voice casual. The former platoon commander, a man named Dmitri with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, had shrugged. "In the tundra. We found it 3 months ago. Abandoned." "Can you show me?" They had driven for 2 hours, the MAZ-7907, grinding across the permafrost until they reached a depression in the endless white. And there it was, the RT-23 lying on its side like a fallen god, its skin pitted and scarred by wind-driven ice. Robert had walked around it slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, looking for what he knew he wouldn't find. The warhead was gone. He wanted to believe that the Soviets had secured it before the collapse, that somewhere in Moscow there was a ledger with a neat entry accounting for one tactical nuclear warhead, serial number such and such, safely stored in a bunker known only to the Kremlin. But his gut feeling told him it was most likely in the hands of bad actors. Dmitri had watched him with knowing eyes. "You are not really a telecommunications engineer, are you?" Robert had met his gaze. "I am really a telecommunications engineer. I'm just other things too." The Russian had nodded slowly. In the Soviet Union, everyone was other things too. This is not so different. They had driven back in silence, and Robert had filed his report through channels that were themselves fragmentary and uncertain. The response had been terse: continue cover, monitor situation, report any developments. So he had continued. He had maintained his equipment, trained local technicians, attended meetings about bandwidth allocation and frequency licensing. He had done his job, both jobs, and waited for the moment when he could leave. That moment was now. A sound brought Robert back to the present, the cockpit door opening. He watched as the pilot emerged, a man in his 50s with the face of someone who had seen too much and expected nothing good. The pilot walked slowly down the aisle, his lips moving silently as he counted passengers. His eyes lingered on the excessive carry-on luggage with barely concealed disdain. Robert was a pilot himself, not commercially, but he'd logged enough hours to recognize the signs. Something was wrong. Then the strangest thing happened. The pilot reached into his pocket and withdrew a kopeck. He held it up to the dim cabin light for a moment, as if examining it for flaws, then flipped it into the air. It spun, catching the light, and landed in his palm. He looked at it, his expression going from neutral to forlorn in the space of a heartbeat, then closed his fist around the coin and returned to the cockpit. Robert listened. The aircraft had 3 engines, starboard, port, and center. The starboard and port engines provided the primary thrust, while the center engine was designed to provide auxiliary thrust rather than main power. It was an elegant design, in its way, a solution to the problem of operating from remote airfields where engine failure couldn't mean certain death. But Robert could hear that the starboard engine had failed to spin up. The whine was wrong, the rhythm off. The Tu-154 was now a 3-engine aircraft with only 2 engines functioning, and one of those was the auxiliary. The mathematics were simple and brutal. They were overloaded, the runway was ice, the temperature was -40 degrees, and they were trying to take off with insufficient thrust. Robert looked at Zhenya and said quietly, "Time to pray, brother." Zhenya's face was pale in the dim light. "I am not a religious man." "Pray anyway." Robert thought to himself. Of all the near-death scrapes he had found himself in, and there had been many, across continents and years, he felt that American expat communications engineer dies in fiery plane crash on remote Siberian runway was not a happy epitaph. Not for the man he really was, the things he'd really done. Then, unexpectedly, a tremendous feeling of peace came over him. He knew that at last, for once and forever, it was most likely all finally over. The mission was complete, or as complete as it would ever be. He had done what he could. The warhead was gone, yes, but he had reported it. Someone somewhere would follow the thread he'd left, or they wouldn't. Either way, it was out of his hands now. The pilot taxied slowly to the end of the runway. Robert heard the flaps creaking into full position, a sound like arthritic joints protesting. The 2 remaining engines began to spin up, first to full power, then beyond, the whine climbing into a scream that vibrated through the airframe. The pilot engaged the brakes. Robert could feel the aircraft straining against itself, every rivet and weld tested, the engines howling their fury into the Siberian night. The cabin filled with the smell of burning metal and jet fuel. Then the pilot released the brakes. The Tu-154 lunged forward like a wounded animal making one last desperate run. Robert was pressed back into his seat as they accelerated, faster and faster, the ice runway blurring beneath them. He could see the end of the runway approaching, the lights, the markers, and beyond them only darkness and tundra. The aircraft showed no signs of rotating. They passed the halfway point, still no rotation. 3/4, the nose remained stubbornly level. Robert could see individual chunks of ice now, could count the runway lights as they flashed past. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white, and he realized he was holding his breath. They passed the end of the runway markers. Robert said what he thought would be his final prayer, not to any god he believed in, but to the universe itself, to the mathematics of lift and drag and thrust, to the physics that governed all things. Please, he thought, just this once, let the numbers work out. Then he felt it. The nose lifted, 1 degree, 5 degrees, and seemed to stop its rotation at 10 degrees. The aircraft remained at that flight angle for what seemed like hours but could only have been seconds. They were no longer accelerating, no longer on the ground, but not truly flying either. They hung suspended in some liminal state between earth and sky, between life and death. The pilot had done it. He'd used ground effect to his advantage, coaxing the overloaded aircraft into the cushion of compressed air between the wings and the ground, using that invisible pillow to compensate for the missing engine's thrust. It was a trick that required perfect timing, perfect judgment, and more courage than Robert could comprehend. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose continued to rise, 15 degrees, 20. The ground fell away beneath them, and they were flying, truly flying, climbing into the darkness above Raduzhny. Robert released his breath and felt his hands begin to shake. Beside him, Zhenya crossed himself, and Robert didn't have the heart to remind him that he'd claimed not to be religious. The landing at Perm was uneventful, which felt like a cosmic joke after the departure. They touched down smoothly, taxied to the terminal, and disembarked into the organized chaos of a Soviet aviation depot. Zhenya and Robert quickly discovered there were no scheduled flights to Moscow for several days. But this was the Wild West following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and rules were negotiable, reality was flexible, and everything had a price. Within 2 hours, they had negotiated the lease of a Tu-155 and crew. The Tu-155 was an experimental aircraft, one of the strangest birds in the Soviet aviation menagerie. It had been designed to use first liquid hydrogen and later liquefied natural gas as fuel, a solution to the oil crisis that never quite materialized, a glimpse of a future that never arrived. Perm was an aviation depot, and many unusual aircraft had been left there to rust after the collapse, monuments to ambitions that had outlived the state that birthed them. The use of the aircraft, 2 pilots, and 1 stewardess cost slightly more than $10,000 US, a fortune by post-Soviet standards, pocket change by the standards of Robert's employers. They boarded in the early evening, and Robert felt as if he'd stepped into a different world. Where the Tu-154 had been cramped and worn, the Tu-155's cabin was spacious and clean. The seats were intact, the windows unscratched. They had the entire aircraft to themselves. The stewardess was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held a wariness Robert recognized. She had learned not to expect good things. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked in careful English. "We have Russian vodka or champagne." Zhenya grinned, the first genuine smile Robert had seen on his face since Raduzhny. "Mix them," he said. "Make us Northern Lights." She looked uncertain. "Northern Lights? Vodka and champagne, equal parts. It's what we called it in the Soviet Union." She nodded and disappeared toward the galley. Robert settled into his seat and looked out the window as the engine spun up. A different sound than the Tu-154, cleaner somehow, the whine of turbines burning liquefied gas instead of kerosene. They lifted off smoothly, climbing into the night sky, and Robert watched Perm fall away beneath them. The lights of the city, the dark ribbon of the Kama River, the vast emptiness beyond. The stewardess returned with 2 glasses filled with a pale, effervescent liquid. Robert took his and sipped. The vodka burned, the champagne tickled, and together they created something that was more than the sum of its parts. "To survival," Zhenya said, raising his glass. "To survival," Robert echoed. They drank in silence for a while, and then Robert noticed the lights outside the window. Greens and blues, shimmering and dancing across the sky, the aurora borealis, the true northern lights, as if the universe had decided to acknowledge their toast. Robert felt something shift inside him, some tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. The words came to him unbidden, a line from a book he'd read years ago. "Peculiar travel suggestions are dancing lessons from God." Kurt Vonnegut, Cat's Cradle, a book about the end of the world, about Ice 9 and the freezing of all things, appropriate perhaps for a man who just escaped Siberia with his life and the knowledge that a nuclear warhead was missing somewhere in the chaos. "Another?" Zhenya asked, draining his glass. "Why not?" Zhenya called the stewardess over. "Can we have another round of Northern Lights?" She smiled apologetically. "We have 2 bottles of vodka remaining, but there is no more Georgian champagne." Zhenya, who had grown up in the Soviet Union and understood that there were often extras stored away for the pilot and crew, leaned forward. "Skalka dinghy?" he asked. "How much?" The stewardess disappeared to consult with the cockpit. When she returned, she said, 500 rubles, with a small smile. Zhenya turned to Robert. "How many rubles do you have?" Robert checked his jacket pocket and found a wad of bills he'd forgotten about. Payment for some small service rendered or change from some transaction. He counted quickly, 4,000 rubles. He handed the entire amount to the stewardess. The smile left her face abruptly. Robert watched as her expression transformed, from pleasure to confusion to something that looked like grief. Her eyes began to glisten, and then tears were streaming down her face. "Did I do something wrong?" Robert asked, alarmed. She shook her head, unable to speak for a moment. When she finally found her voice, her logic was impeccable and devastating. "If you are willing to give me 4,000 rubles, when I am only asking for 500 rubles, she said slowly, "it means that my money is no good. And if my money is no good, that means that my country may be at an end." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Robert felt the pleasant fog of intoxication burn away, replaced by a clarity that was almost painful. He had been taught to maintain situational awareness, to drink only enough to fit in, to never let his guard down completely. But here, at 30,000 feet above the Russian heartland, in an experimental aircraft that was designed to use liquid hydrogen like some kind of retrofuturistic dream, he found he didn't want to be aware anymore. He didn't want to think about missing warheads or collapsing empires or the weight of secrets he carried. The stewardess was crying openly now, and Zhenya was trying to comfort her in rapid Russian that Robert only half understood. Something about how the ruble would recover, how Russia would endure, how they had survived worse. But Robert knew better. He had seen the numbers, read the reports, watched the slow motion collapse from the inside. The Soviet Union was gone, and what was replacing it was still formless, still uncertain. The ruble was indeed becoming worthless, and this young woman's tears were not just for currency, but for everything it represented: stability, certainty, the world she had known. He had given her 4,000 rubles for 500 rubles, worth of champagne because, in his mind, the money was already play money, monopoly bills, the scrip of a nation that no longer existed. And she had understood that immediately, had read in his casual generosity the truth that her government would never admit. It was over. Robert closed his eyes and let himself fall into sleep, his last conscious thought a jumble of images. Prima ballerinas and chicken Kiev, the Upigit climbing the frozen tower, the mayor's bewildered face watching Homer Simpson, the RT lying in the tundra like a fallen god, the pilot flipping his coin, the northern lights dancing outside the window. Peculiar travel suggestions are dancing lessons from God. And if that was true, Robert thought as consciousness slipped away, then what he had learned in Siberia was this: that the crossover point was not just a temperature where 2 scales converged, but a moment in history where 2 worlds met, the old and the new, the Soviet and the post-Soviet, the certain and the uncertain. He had stood at that crossover point, had felt it in his bones at -40 degrees on a runway made of ice, and he had survived. For now, that was enough. When Robert woke, they were descending into Moscow. The city spread beneath them like a circuit board, lights and darkness in geometric patterns. Zhenya was already awake, looking out the window with an expression Robert couldn't read. "We made it," Zhenya said. "We did." That was quite a journey, Zhenya said, turning from the window. I've never been on anything like that Tu-155 before. Smooth flight, at least. Much better than the ride out of Raduzhny. Robert said with a slight smile. That's for certain, so back to Moscow for you. For a few days, then I'm not sure. You? Home to St. Petersburg. My family will be glad to see me. Zhenya paused. Thank you for the drinks. The northern lights were something special. They were, Robert agreed, watching the city lights grow larger below them. The Tu-155 touched down smoothly, and they taxied to a terminal that looked almost normal, almost Western, almost like the world Robert had left behind when he'd first come to Russia 5 years ago. But it wasn't that world anymore. That world was gone, lost somewhere in the tundra along with a nuclear warhead and the certainty of the Cold War's simple equations. As they disembarked, Robert looked back at the stewardess. She had composed herself, her face professionally neutral once more, but her eyes met his and in them he saw a question. What happens now? He wished he had an answer. Instead, he nodded once, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of shared understanding, and walked down the stairs into the Moscow night. Behind him, the Tu-155's engines wound down, their whine fading into silence. Ahead of him lay debriefings and reports, new assignments and old enemies, the endless game of shadows and secrets. But for this moment, standing on the tarmac with Zhenya beside him and the taste of northern lights still on his tongue, Robert allowed himself to simply be. A man who had survived, who had seen the crossover point and lived to tell the tale. Even if he were to tell it to anyone in Washington, they were paper pushers who would never truly understand. Even if the only people who would ever know the cosmic truth of that trip were a Russian partner, a desperate pilot, a weeping stewardess, and the Upigit workers who had climbed a frozen tower because a stranger had asked them to and paid them fairly for their trouble. The true people. Robert smiled at the thought and followed Zhenya into the terminal, into the chaos of the new Russia, into whatever came next. He would become a ghost again for a while, maybe on a warm beach in the south of France. The crossover point was behind him now. But he knew, with the certainty of a scientist who understood that some equations had no solution, that he would carry it with him forever, the memory of -40 degrees, the temperature where two worlds became one, if only for a moment.